Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another great Holder Initiative conversation. Thanks for coming out this evening. We wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the presidential 2020 elections that are happening next week, it seems, right? Given all the news. So we put together an extraordinary panel with some extraordinary individuals who are going to give us some insight on this coming election. So everyone knows Attorney General Eric Holder. Once again, thank you for coming home back to Columbia. As you know, Columbia graduate, Columbia College 73, Columbia Law School 76. 82nd Attorney General and one of the longest serving Attorney Generals in this country, and also someone who has a very personal relationship to this evening's discussion, and we'll get there early on. So thanks so much for joining us again.
Okay.
We also have Jim Dow, who is the editor for the op-ed page of the New York Times. And he's been with the New York Times for over 25 years, was head of the national desk.
Don't promote me.
Say what?
Don't promote me. I was the deputy national editor.
Deputy national editor of the national desk, also in charge of the metropolitan desk. Has been involved with reporting as well. Had a report on the Afghanistan war that won an Emmy Award. Is that right?
That's right.
An Emmy Award, and a background in history, which is going to come in helpful this evening.
I can remember any of it.
And then we're also delighted to welcome back Karine Jean-Pierre. Thank you so much for joining us again. Karine is a professor here at SIPA, and she is also running the MoveOn.org senior advisor and national spokeswoman for MoveOn.org. She was deputy campaign manager for Martin O'Malley for president. She was also worked for President Obama during the campaign. And so we're actually thrilled that she's back. And you also got your degree from SIPA.
I did. I graduated from
right?
SIPA in 2003.
2003.
Yeah.
So we're thrilled to have you back. Thank you.
Always happy to be back.
And we're also thrilled to have Nate Silver with us. Nate Silver, you all know as well, a leading statistician, perhaps the leading statistician in the country. Award-winning founder of FiveThirtyEight, which probably gives us all of our information, all the information that we need. And it's currently with CBS. Is that
ABC.
ABC. I've got that somewhere here. But he's also the author of a terrific book called The Signal and the Noise, Why So Many Predictions Fail, But Some Don't. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it's really the go-to book to get a sense of kind of how we go about making these, how Nate goes about making these predictions. So thank you all for coming. The way we're going to do is we're going to start. Each guest is going to have a few words to give the kind of just their initial thoughts on this coming election, and then I'm going to be pointing some questions. So, Eric, do you want to start us off with some initial thoughts?
It's good to be back. Always good to be home here at Morningside Heights. I think that you've almost got a tale of two cities here, in the sense that on the Republican side, I think that you're going to see something that's maybe fairly traditional, assuming that nothing totally untraditional and catastrophic from the Trump perspective happens. I suspect you'll see an incumbent president renominated. There might be some, candidates who will run against him, but with an approval rating as high as he is within the party, I suspect he'll be nominated. On the Democratic side, on the other hand, I think we will see something that, at least from my lifetime, I'm not sure I've ever seen before, both in terms of the number of candidates. I don't think, and I hope this is something we get into, I don't think that the ideological bridge or ideological differences between those candidates is as great as people say, or as much as the media might want to portray. Not your folks, not your. But it will be interesting to see how, I guess, an announced 18 candidates, maybe going as high as 19, 20, how that is all going to play out. Tom Perez has already made, the DNC chair has already made the determination that we'll have 2 days of debates starting in June. And so they're just trying to logistically, how do you deal with that? And it'll be interesting to see how long people can stay in. The numbers that people are announcing in terms of monies raised in the first quarter, or at least so far, almost everybody I've heard, pretty substantial. And I think people are going to potentially have the capacity, the financial capacity, to stay in for extended periods of time.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Thanks, Eric. Jim, some thoughts? Opening thoughts?
So we were having a conversation around the op-ed desk a couple weeks ago about our upcoming enterprise for politics, and one of the editors mentioned that we'll have our first debate in June. And I just had to do a double take of what? A debate? Wait, it's 2019. And I think back to what seems like a lifetime ago, but really, 2015 to be precise, when I was the deputy national editor at the time, and we were mostly thinking about mass shootings and police brutality stories, and ever so distantly about the upcoming Hillary Clinton versus Marco Rubio campaign. Or was it Jeb Bush? Maybe it was Jeb Bush. But, and an editor at the time said, my gosh, Trump is getting big crowds. What do you make of that? And I said, forget it, it'll be gone by February. So don't listen to any of my predictions for the rest of the night. I know nothing.
Yeah.
But, in 4 short years, our world is sort of blown up. Brexit changed the nature of politics in Europe, and now Donald Trump has changed it in the United States and perhaps beyond. And it's, for those who worry about the stability of democratic institutions, it's a slightly scary time. But speaking here as an op-ed editor, it's also a time of great ferment and ideas and debate. And I think we're, for better or worse, about to really enter a really quite high velocity into that period of really talking about remaking at least the Democratic Party. And perhaps there'll be a little bit of talk on the Republican side as well. Donald Trump arguably has already remade it. And I guess there's part of me that's actually a little bit optimistic that out of this we can have a useful and important and valuable debate about how we move the country and the world perhaps into a new era where technology is different, the economy is different, and our politics are different.
Thanks, Jim. Karine?
First of all, thanks so much for having us. It's good to see so many of you. So I've worked on about 4 or 5 presidential. I teach campaign management at SEPA. I've led some campaigns, state and local, citywide, and I'm in a place, kind of touching on what you just said with predictability. It's hard to predict anything, especially in the times that we're living in. I'm sure Nate will probably say something different, being a statistician, but it truly is, because I look at this field, I look at the 2020, and there's something so normal about it, right? There's something about that you're like, oh, it's diverse, it's a large field, they're talking about the issues, they're raising money, how great it's representing there is a representation of our country, the diversity, and it's really wonderful. And then you look at the other side, and you think, wow, this is so abnormal. And I think about 2016, and I'm thinking, okay, well, how does Donald Trump play in 2020? What does that look like? Because nothing sticks to him. He plays in a totally different political playing field. And I wonder, and I try to figure out, how are the two going to clash in 2020? And I'm just not sure. You can make an argument saying, well, he's really unpopular, he's divisive, he hasn't expanded his base, it should make sense that a Democrat would win in 2020. And then you're like, okay, well, nothing sticks on this guy. He seems to get away with things. 80 to 90%, we were just talking about this, of the Republican Party still with him. And so it is, I look at this 2020 and I just scratch my head. I try to figure out, okay, how is this going to be called and what will this look like? But first of all, it's still too early, so to be fair, but it's hard. It really, really is difficult because it's just an abnormal time that we're living in. And the politics of Trump is something that I think many of us haven't seen before. And I just don't know how the two are going to clash. So that's kind of where my thoughts are.
Yeah. Thanks, Karine. Nate?
I mean, in terms of the Democratic primary, it strikes me that we're kind of stuck in between two different templates that we've seen primaries take in the past. One template is that you have a field like 2016 or 2008, where in both years Hillary Clinton was seen as the next in line candidate. Same for like George H.W. Bush in 1988, for example. But you have primaries, we have a clear next in line candidate, maybe the runner-up last time, maybe a vice president, maybe someone who's in the lineage of a president. And they start out with 30 or 40% in the polls, and there are insurgent candidates that come up to try and challenge them. And often that fails, but sometimes you have a case like President Obama where that works. Then you have primaries like, say, the 2016 GOP race or the 1992 Democratic race, where it's a free-for-all. No one who has super high name recognition at the start is in the race. There's like not an obvious successor. And those tend to be bigger fields. Those tend to be a little bit more fun, probably for the media to cover. And it sorts itself out, and gradually someone gets momentum, often by doing well in Iowa or New Hampshire, and then emerges with momentum to win the nomination, although you also have long, drawn-out, chaotic nominations, too. But with Democrats, we're kind of stuck in between those two things, where both Bernie and Biden can kind of make claims to be the next-in-line candidate. Biden having been the vice president to the most recent Democratic president, Bernie having been obviously the second runner-up, or the first runner-up to Hillary Clinton last time. But they also both have big liabilities. To start out with, one of them is 77, one is 78. I forget which is which, so I won't try and get that right, but they're much
Bernie's
older. Bernie's, I think, a year older.
Yeah.
For another one, neither one has an enormous amount of support from the party establishment. You don't seem to see Obama world people thrilled with Biden potentially getting in. Bernie is not technically a Democrat, did not get very many endorsements last time around, has had a few this time, but clearly people are a little trepidatious about them. And then, you have other stuff too. How interested is Bernie in expanding the coalition beyond his very enthusiastic base? How out of touch generationally is Biden, and how big a deal are these allegations? Not really allegations, they've happened in like public view, a lot of them, of touching women inappropriately. And so you have, I don't know, the potential for a lot of chaos. I think the potential for, things such as a brokered convention, where if you have 100% of the vote between all these new candidates, then that's one thing. It's still hard to get 50%, but you can do it. However, if like Biden and Bernie each have 20% of the vote they keep for themselves and can't really expand beyond that, then all of a sudden you're dividing 60% up between 6 or 7 or 8 really interesting candidates, and that becomes very messy. So yeah, to say that it's unpredictable, it's not just like a cliche. It's like this really is a very unpredictable primary.
Thanks. Yeah, so so I've got my little cheat sheet from the New York Times that shows me, who's in the running and who's likely to be in the running. We got, according to the New York Times, although Nate, it's a few less for Nate. We got 18 Democratic declared, well-recognized candidates. Maybe 16 if you cut off a few, according to Nate. We've got likely to run. We've got, of course, Biden and Bullock. We have a few might runs, unlikely to run. Now, also on the cheat sheet is Eric Holder, who's decided not to run. So I thought we would start there. Give us a kind of a personal entry into all of this electioneering, and get a sense from you about your decision, and also the decision in this particular context, right? Because I mean, what we want to try and understand right now is why is it that there are so many people running? What does it say about our politics? But how did it affect your decision-making process?
Okay. Well, one thing I can guarantee, that of those 18, and maybe those 20, whatever, each one of them gets up in the morning and looks in the mirror and sees a president, right? For me, the factors that went into my decision not to run, or the things that I considered, we did polling, we looked at sources of money, figured out what would be the path. And then, as you hear it all the time, it really is true. Where was my family with regard to, a potential run? And there are any number. I could check a number of those boxes. There was one I could not. Almost guess what that one was. And the other thing is, I mean, do you have within you? I guess those four things. So the other thing is, do you have within you that which you will expose yourself to, both in terms of physically being in a lot of places where you might not normally spend a lot of time, and then if you're a person who's been in public life for a fairly long period of time, has done hopefully a lot of good things, and there are more than a few missteps. Are you prepared to deal with the ways in which those missteps are going to be portrayed? What's the impact going to be? You're going to be able to, stomach that stuff, but also are you going to be able to? Do you want to expose your family to those kinds of things? So, from my perspective, there were, as I said, I was okay in a number of those areas, but at the end of the day, it just was not the right decision. And that was really kind of unaffected by the size of the field. I think it's a very individualized decision. I think you almost have to make, irrespective of the number of people who you're going to be running against. It might have been different, Eric, you're going to run in 2016 when it's, Hillary and Bernie. All right, I think that's a little different than, if you've got 10, 15 candidates. But I think the possibility exists that the Democratic nominee is now polling at maybe 1%, 2%, 5%, something like that. And that the people who are polling at even 15, 20%, 10% are not going to, they might not be the nominee. I think it's a very unpredictable year, and I think because there's no heir apparent, there's not necessarily a clear path. A lot of people there think, I could pull this off.
Okay. So, not affected by the number of folks who are in the game right now. In terms of just historically, how unprecedented is this, Nate, that we have so many people already declared?
So it'll wind up being the largest field ever. You can debate who's a major candidate and not right now, whether Marianne Williamson counts as major. If I'd be impressed if I could name, I probably could all 18, right? But that's pretty hard, it's my job.
You want to try?
I need something to write down with. I probably could, but I'm not going to try right now. I think
okay, all right.
Not be the best use of the audience's time.
We'll take bets later.
But you're going to have more people that haven't declared yet run also, including Biden and Steve Bullock and Seth Moulton, and I'm not sure that all these people really have rationales to run. But you're going to wind up with a field of roughly 20. The largest field ever was 17, which was a GOP 4 years ago. In the early days, when we were transitioning from a kind of situation where literally party elders picked the nominee in smoke-filled rooms to where it was elected democratically, so in 72 and 76, you had very large fields where you had surprise winners. So you had McGovern win in '72, in part because he had helped to create the new rules, which he was now playing under. And in '76, you had Jimmy Carter kind of come out of nowhere, win Iowa, and gain momentum and win one of the more unpredictable nominations you've had in the past. Like, usually when you have that many nominees, it's a sign that things can get unpredictable and chaotic. And so you could have someone who is at 2% or 3% win potentially. But look, on the one hand, it's a sign that no one is intimidated by Biden and Bernie, because I think Biden would say, I am the heir apparent. I'm polling at 30%, which is pretty decent, and I was the last vice president. Democrats like me a lot, but Democrats aren't acting like he's the heir apparent, nor for Bernie. I think there are some candidates that feel like, hey, now Trump won, therefore that means that anything can happen.
Yeah.
We can scrutinize that assumption potentially. You know, I tend to think that Pete Buttigieg has a chance and say Eric Swalwell has no chance. But it would be hard, apart from my intuition, to like prove that to anyone. And if you are Eric Swalwell, you're probably looking yourself in the mirror and saying, hey, I see myself as a future president. And number three, I think that incentives are a bit perverse where if you were to want to get onto TV more often, then you would have an aspiration to run for president to sell more books and raise your speaking fee and raise your stature. And so someone who occupies a position where they're less prominent, like a mayor or a representative, versus someone who's been a senator or a governor or a cabinet member or attorney general, right? You know, in some ways, the less prestige you have, the less you have to lose by running, and so you have very little filter anymore. And fourth, you have now ways via social media and online fundraising people to connect with an audience when they couldn't have before. There's like no real way for, you know, Andrew Yang is a candidate who is very popular among some students, some people on the internet, right? Interesting guy. You know, 20 years ago, the media would say Andrew Yang is not a serious candidate, and therefore he has no way to get his message out, right? Unless some debate organizer decides to include him or whatever. He just like literally barnstorms, does a tour. Now he can have a very robust presence on the internet and go on lots of podcasts that Democrats don't normally go on, and raise lots of money online, and like can become a player in the conversation. So we don't know what happens when you have these 17 or 20 people fields. It does seem to me like the way Democrats' rules are set up, it could cause problems. Where unlike Republicans, because Trump for a long time would get 30, 35, 37% of the vote, in the GOP what happens is that you have winner-take-all primaries beyond a certain point, or winner-take-most, so you can eventually win you know, every delegate in Arizona with 39% of the vote or whatever. With Democrats, it's very proportional, and so if you have support divided 3 or 4 ways, if Bernie wins New Hampshire, I don't know who wins Iowa, Amy Klobuchar wins Iowa, Kamala Harris wins California, which goes on Super Tuesday, Beto wins Texas on Super Tuesday, right? You have a lot of potential for chaos, and then all of a sudden you don't have that many states at the end of the process to help decide. You don't have superdelegates on the first ballot anymore to help decide, and so I don't know. I mean, you know, I think it's one of the most important factors working in Trump's favor is the fact that you are going to have this kind of long and chaotic and probably pretty nasty primary process.
Interesting. So we've already kind of touched on a few of the possible causes of this unprecedented number of candidates, right? The fact that there may be other incentives to running, right? That even if you're not going to win, you get your name in the papers a lot more, get more attention, may have an easier time with a coming election as governor or senator or whatever. The fact that Trump won in 2016 because here's a candidate who, you know, when he announced his nomination, I don't know if you recall, but, you know, like the New York Daily News had him with a clown face, right? I mean, they added a red nose and whatnot. I mean, we really did think that it was a long shot. But who gets elected? I suppose also there's a kind of a reaction to Trump himself, which is causing a lot of people to feel as if they have to run in some sense. They kind of like an obligation to run. So lots of causes. What does it tell us? What does it tell us about politics today? Karine, do you want to start, and then Jim? What does it tell us about kind of like what does it reflect on politics? If we move away from the question of predicting who's going to win for a few minutes at least, since it's kind of unpredictable, what does it tell us about our current state of politics?
That's a good question. I think that there are, like you said, there are different reasons why people are running. And some folks are thinking, you know, the state of politics, the state of our democracy is in disarray. We need to save it. We have to jump in and you know, do our best fight, and it's our duty, right? I think there's some people who probably think it's truly their duty. And I do think that there are folks who are maybe running for vice president or maybe looking for a secretary position. But I do think when you look at our politics, I think folks are very worried and very scared, and these candidates are tapping into that. You see some candidates that are running on particular issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's gun reform, whether it's income inequality, and they're taking specific lanes, and maybe the hope is to turn that into a movement and really talk about issues that people care about. You hear conversations about reparations, which has never been part of the kind of dialogue in a presidential. So issues, right? The issues are a big deal in this presidential primary for Democrats, like big ideas, bold solutions. And I think that's what a lot of the Democratic base wants. And we've seen this in the last 2-3 years. One of the things that got the base really going and led to some wins in 2017 and also in 2018 was healthcare, to stop the repeal of ACA. And so I think that when you look at the last 3 years, there are a couple of things. Like I said, there's issues. People are really want to talk about the issues that matter to them, like healthcare. People want to save our democracy and are really worried about the future of this country. And I see, like, at least on our side, that's kind of where the politics is. I worry about what's going on the Republican side because they seem to not step up, not be a check on this president. He's doing the things that they want him to do. If you look at the conservative kind of agenda that he's gotten done, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's deregulation. So there is a divide. This country is incredibly divided, and on ideology, on where we stand on the spectrum of the partisan spectrum, but I do think on the Democratic side, there's a lot of energy, and these candidates can easily tap into it because they want, the base wants to hear about the issues and how they're going to move the country forward.
So, so it's interesting that you think that there's a real focus on the issues as a result, in part, of the Trump presidency, perhaps, right? Jim, what do you think?
I mean, I would pin a lot of this on the Trump effect, and I do think there are a lot of candidates because people are looking at 2016 and thinking, that guy did it, why not me? Yeah. And a lot of candidates means a dark horse can pull it off. But beyond just what happened in the primary season of 2016, I just think Donald Trump, and probably Donald Trump isn't the actual cause of the fluidity in our politics, but he certainly hastened it coming on. He's utterly changed our thinking about what's normal in politics, what it takes to win, how you can present yourself, how often you have to tell the truth, how much you have to actually know about the levers of government. He's changed our thinking about all those things. And he's imposed all kinds of ideas that on our view of the world and our role in the world that are, because of his being in the White House, he's forced the rest of the world to pay attention to these ideas. And I think the result is that everything is fluid. I don't think the center in American politics is very clear anymore. And I think that is actually an opening for a lot of interesting candidates. You can have people talking about socialism and not feeling that they have to run away from the word. You can have people embracing the idea of being progressive or liberal and not feeling like they have to run away from that word. There's a lot of energy in the base of the Democratic Party that's largely an anti-Trump energy, perhaps, but that's also fueling kind of a real ferment of ideas from that side. And at the same time, you have people who are from what used to be the Clinton, Eric Holder part of the party, the sort of mainstream, more centrist part of the party that is saying, no, wait, you have to capture a part of the Republican Party that's disaffected with Trump. There's a lot of independents out there that aren't going to want to appeal to AOC's ideas. And the result is this very, very interesting, I think, clash of ideas that's both really interesting but also really unsettling, and is going to make it incredibly hard to figure out who's going to come out of this as a winner.
Did you say the Clinton Holder centrist part? That ain't me.
Sorry, all right.
Because I think this is going to be a base versus base election. I think that Republicans, in spite of all that would have brought down a president under normal circumstances or severely wounded him, are 100%, I think, as Karine says, 85, 90% behind this president, in spite of, porno stars, campaign finance violations, whatever's in the Mueller report, separating kids at the border. They got Supreme Court justices, tax cuts, deregulation. He's our guy. The Democratic response, I think that has alarmed substantial numbers of Democrats. I think there's a huge Democratic reaction to that. And I think the question is, who's base? I don't think this is, I think, first of all, there's this notion of independence is really a little overplayed. Independents, I don't think I don't know, if we say the elections, I don't know, 20%, 30% independent, something like that. I think the number is actually lower than that. And I think this is going to be an election, though, where it's going to be those Democratic independents, Republican independents against that which is the hardcore Democratic base, hardcore Republican base, and who gets their people to the polls, who's most energized. We were talking in the green room before, as in Wisconsin, in the last couple of weeks, campaigning for a woman's running for Supreme Court. Elections that have not gotten a lot of attention in the past. We were successful last year in electing a Democrat in an off-year election to a Wisconsin Supreme Court seat. Our polls in this election indicated that our candidate was going to win again, and she, in fact, got more votes than her Democratic counterpart got last year, and yet she lost to a Republican who is, by any objective measure, it was a terrible candidate. And it was because, at least as we've kind of poked around so far, you saw a huge increase in the number of Republican votes. Again, our base came out, actually exceeded the number from last year, but the Republican base came out. And I have to say base because, again, if you look at this candidate, the Republican candidate, only a Republican could love this guy.
Eric, I just want to say I was just trying to give a boost to your independent campaign for president there. Sorry about that.
I was going to save that announcement for the end.
So this question of the Trump phenomenon from 2016, or someone who's polling at 1%, it raises the big issue of electability. It seems a big term that's floating around a lot right now. Who is electable, and does that term make any sense anymore, Nate?
Yeah, actually, I think.
Go ahead.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that people will make from 2016 is to assume that because Trump that everything is different, right? We had a midterm in 2018 that in many respects looked like a very normal midterm, where the president, after 2 years in office, there's a backlash, the other party's voters are extremely enthusiastic. Over the course of the election year, the wave builds, right? And they wind up winning a bunch of seats in Congress. There were some things that were different. Turnout was extremely high for a midterm in 2018. You also had extremely partisan results, so that in red states and districts, the GOP obviously gained a couple of Senate seats, and so that was a little bit different. But in some ways, the midterm was like this kind of very normal thing, right? And so I don't know. I mean, in terms of electability, I think there are a few different things you can look at. One is you can look at which candidates have performed well relative to their states. So, the fact that Amy Klobuchar wins by 20 points is more impressive than Elizabeth Warren because Minnesota is a fairly purple state that Trump almost won, whereas Massachusetts is very blue. It's one way you can look at it. You can look at who was perceived as close to the center, even though it's gone out of fashion. In general, voters do tend to reward moderation. You can look, and this is sometimes the trade-off with that, you look at who has demonstrated the ability to organize and to generate enthusiasm and to raise a lot of money. It will not be cheap to run against Trump. And you're going to need a lot of organization because there are more Democrats than Republicans, but it's sometimes harder to turn them out. You can look at who has a clean bill of health in terms of scandals, although that's part of what the primary process does, is it vets different candidates. So for me, it's like, I guess I have views about who is relatively more or relatively less electable. I'm not sure that we're at a point in the process now where articulating those views adds all that much value. And I think the margin of error on those views is outweighed by the fact that, look, the best test of who's electable in the general election is probably this very long and difficult primary process where you have to do so many different things, perform well in different parts of the country, do well with, in rooms where everyone's donating lots of money, do well in small, bars or coffee shops in Iowa and New Hampshire, have a lot of physical endurance, deal with both real and unfair media criticism, bounce back from losses because no one's going to win all 50 states in a year like this one. You have to show a lot of skills, and whichever candidate survives that process will probably be a stronger candidate than they look right now. And so having this having this contest is a great idea and a great test of electability. Again, I do worry that you might wind up in a place where it's not easy to crown a winner if you have the electorate divided 3 or 4 or 5 ways, and all of a sudden you don't have enough states left to really break the ties.
Mm-hmm. So, as a follow-up, who fits in that category?
I mean, look, what I said earlier about the ability to seem like you're playing to the center. I mean, in some ways, Democrats have an advantage, which is that there are more Democrats than Republicans in the electorate. If you look at 2012, Obama narrowly lost independents to Romney. And both Obama and Romney won the overwhelming share of voters in their party. But Obama won by a decent margin by about 4 percentage points in the popular vote because there are more Democrats than Republicans, and Obama knew how to turn Democrats out.
Okay. So
Democrats do have that luxury of winning
but
either with their base or with.
I was trying to be a little bit more specific.
I don't think he's going to go there.
Of the 18, maybe we'll start with you, Karine. Of the folks who are in the game right now, who has some of those characteristics, in your opinion, in terms of ability to ability to raise, stamina, etc.?
So this goes back to my opening kind of comments, which is, in a normal world, in a normal electorate, a normal time, you probably could have a better sense of who would be the top 2 or the top 3 by this end of or close to the end of this process, or at least as we get to the first the first election, which is the Iowa caucus. It's really hard to truly figure out because anything could happen. There's a debate coming up in June. And I do go back to 2016 because you had 17 candidates on the Republican side. When Donald Trump announced, he was at 1%. He announced in the summertime, so maybe I think there was a lot of, he announced in the summertime and he was kind of saying, well, he was saying crazy, divisive, nasty things. And he got this media attention that really helped carry him through. He didn't raise really any money. He didn't do anything that was normal for a candidate. And he ended up winning the nomination and clearly becoming the President of the United States. So this is the question that I have, which is, have things changed so much, or does the rules only apply to him? Now, coming back to the Democratic primary in this time around, I think it's really important that Democrats have a competitive primary. I think it does us good. It's better for us when we have a competitive Democratic primary. And that's when we'll see. We'll see. They'll be tested during the debates, as I mentioned. They'll be tested with money. They'll be tested to see who they can get out to, to come to the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. And we will see. There is something that Nate said that I really do want to point out, which is the delegate game has changed, which could really screw up this whole process at the end. It truly, truly can. Mm-hmm. And we could have a brokered convention. Mm-hmm. And we don't know how it's going to play out with mm-hmm. that as mm-hmm. well, which is why it's hard to answer. It's hard to see, okay, well, who's going to get this lane and who's going to get that mm-hmm. lane? We just truly, truly don't know. Mm-hmm.
Now, on this question of electability, though,
you're not going to give up on it, are you?
The issue is not just...
one of us to say something.
One of us is going to get to that, give you an answer.
I take it when we talk about electability, it's not just that we're talking about who could win the Democratic primary, but who could win the presidency, right? I mean, so there's more, it's more to it than just who can win in this field, I think, when we think about electability. We also, we're looking at past that at the final election, I think, we have a notion of electability. So it's like, maybe Bernie or Biden could possibly raise the most money or have the biggest numbers or something like that, as you were suggesting, as the, almost heirs, but too old, so we don't know. But then the question with both of them is the question of electability, right? And on that one, it's just it seems to be almost a different question than who's going to win the primary. And it's hard to think about. Jim?
Well, I'm going to start off by saying I think the idea of electability is a bad idea. And when I covered politics, I always thought it was sort of a way for reporters to kind of focus a few issues and make themselves sound sort of authoritative when they were picking the field. I think every race is different, and what comes out in the many months of a campaign change and define the field in ways we just can't imagine, and it changes as we go. As some of the things Eric talked about, where like you have to decide how much time you want to spend in Iowa versus New Hampshire, and how well you're going to communicate to Iowa voters versus New Hampshire voters. And what Nate talked about with just stamina, pure stamina, the ability to like get up and do it 8 times a day in 4 different states. And how good are you going to be at that in month 5 versus month 2? I mean, all those things totally change. And meanwhile, the world is changing under you. You could have a recession. You could have the beginning of, international tensions that feel like we're moving towards war. All those things is a constantly fluid thing. And so the idea of electability, I think, is just insane to even talk about. But you've asked the question.
That being said,
and I'm not going to name anybody because that'd be nuts. But I do think that the trick is always that balancing act. Like, how do you energize the base that Eric talked about? Because that's what's going to win you the primaries. But meanwhile, even as you're signaling to them and talking to them, how are you you're keeping your eye on the long run? How are you going to not alienate those more centrist voters, more general election voters, even maybe Republican voters that might come into your camp? And And so much of that is just the pure political skill of the candidate. And you can sort of like think demographically, that person's going to have to look like this, and, you know, be of this background and this age, and that's going to be, or this education, and had these life experiences, you know, veteran or an Ivy League education or non-Ivy League education, whatever. And those are all going to be meaningless. It's going to be how good are you in communicating and campaigning and raising money, which is kind of a form of campaigning, as Eric knows. And if you're great at those things, it's going to change the dynamic. It's going to make you, it may enable you to say things to primary voters who are very liberal and still communicate to the general election voters in a way that, you know, you're winning both of them over just because of your force of character.
Can I just say a word that's worse than electability is likability? I hate that word, likability, and it always is just towards women. And it's just, it's something that we just need to stop saying.
But you know what? It's a bad word, but it is a reality I think we need to face.
Yep.
Because female candidates face misogyny.
Exactly.
You know?
Sexism,
and that is
misogyny.
something that, I don't say that we should not support Elizabeth Warren, Gillibrand, you know, Kamala. Women can't win. A woman can win.
Yep.
But there's a headwind, I think, that female candidates have to deal with that male candidates do not. And I think that we'll talk about this more. We should understand that, you know, it's, give me the paper, I'll tell you. You know,
Okay.
Because I think of this 18, 20 people, let me see, right? Oh, bear with me, bear with me.
We're going to get an answer.
1, 2, 3,
You're just going to give us a number, no names?
5, 6,
That's a lot.
7, or of the 20, I think 7 would probably not beat Trump. Trump might have a good chance of winning against 7 of them.
So that's,
Wait.
so I take it that's, so I saw the
that's 13
fingers.
exist-
I saw that, he was, no, okay. But that is the note, that is the word, that is the notion of electability that we want to reject in some way, or that it feels as if we want to, or that some of us are uncomfortable with, which is exactly can't beat Trump.
I mean,
Right?
I think there is nothing wrong with electability as a concept, although I do think we get these uncomfortable discussions about, like, when you say electable, can that be a euphemism for like a straight white male candidate? And sometimes that can be. And I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence about, well, you can debate it. I actually don't want to, that'd be a whole nother discussion about, like, what advantages do people of color face when they run? What advantages and disadvantages do women face when they run? Now you have a gay candidate who could win, right? And I think those are probably 3 actually separate conversations. And then you get into cases like Kamala Harris, where you have multiple racial, you know, she's both Black and Asian, and she's also a woman, obviously, and so it gets, I think, quite complicated. I do think the public is concerned about electability. If you ask Democrats, would you rather have a candidate that adheres to all your policy views or that would beat Trump? In most polls, more Democrats say actually beating Trump is the priority. So if you had like a model where it said, oh, this candidate has a 60% chance, this candidate has a 30% chance, I think Democrats would be crazy to pick the 30% candidate. The problem is we don't have that model. We don't really have a lot of empirical guidance, in fact, on kind of what it means to be electable. Again, if you look at US Senate races and House races, there is something where if you run more to the center and defy your party more often, that seems to help. And Trump, people think of Trump now as being very extreme, but Trump in some ways critiqued Republican orthodoxy on the Iraq War, on free trade, to some extent on entitlement programs, critiqued the Bushes and this dynastic nature of politics in the Republican Party. And so voters actually saw him as being more moderate than Hillary Clinton in 2016. They do not anymore. Now people, I would say correctly, understand that with Trump, you were buying also the Ryan McConnell agenda on economics, plus you're getting policy on immigration, for example, on that's way to the right of even what the GOP establishment had wanted before, and you're getting a lot of baggage around race and criminal justice and all these other things, right? People actually have shifted now, and I think Trump is very conservative. But he ran to the center more than people, I think, realized in 2016.
Can I?
Jim, you want to?
I just want to talk about electability in 2008. President Obama faced that. And there was a question of, is he electable? Can he win Iowa, right? And the goal there was to win Iowa so he can show that he was electable. And once that happens, he was able to win South Carolina. He got a lot of establishment voters. He got a lot of African-American voters after winning Iowa. So that actually played into the primary election for him in those first 4 early states. And it is a problem, I think, you're right, Nate, with candidates of color in particular, and women, and they have to face that headwind for sure.
See, but I think electability matters a great deal, given the stakes here and given who the hell we're running against. I'm a Democrat, all right, so given who we're running against and the state of this country, or the thought of 4 more years of this guy and Supreme Court nominations and all the other things that a second Trump presidency would mean. So that, from my perspective, doesn't mean that I'm automatically dismissing somebody who is African American, who's a woman, who's gay. But I do want that person, whatever their attributes are, to be somebody who I think can win. And I'm willing to sacrifice, if that person agrees with me on 70% of the issues, that's fine, There's not a person on in that list of 13 or whatever that I came up with who I agree with, on 100% of the issues. I support every one of those 13 and campaign very vigorously against Donald Trump.
And you see that in the base. When you do polling, you see that people are saying, the respondents are saying, we want somebody who could win. And I think that is very much in the minds of voters right now.
My problem with that
as of
is
now, because it's early. As of now, it's early.
My problem with that is I don't think people know what it takes to win. I think if you ask 100 people what it takes to win, you're going to get 100 answers. It's a completely subjective measure, and therefore kind of meaningless in my view. And I know, you guys may feel differently. I just think people may sort of go along with who they think, especially when they're answering pollsters' questions, they're going to maybe go with what first comes to mind because that's what they saw on television and that's what they read. But, is that really what they think? I don't know. Very often I don't think people know what they know or know what they think. And I don't think and I think they all have different ideas on what really makes someone electable. Is it the issues? Maybe. Maybe it's just how they like how they look on TV.
Right.
But I think that I think that's an important point, because I think the decision that people make in casting a presidential ballot doesn't mean that people are disregarding or not taking into account positions, but there's a very personal thing that happens there.
Totally.
Reagan had that thing where if you polled on positions that he was taking, he would not, you would have thought, generated necessarily, the kind of support that he ultimately got. But people liked him, got him, saw him as authentic, in much the same way, I think, in a misperceived way, that people saw Trump in 2016. So I think there is that undefined thing, that likability, electability, with a smattering of, with a good dose of, what your positions are. That's why I think this thing is so hard to ultimately predict. And now Nate, the statistician, will tell me I'm totally wrong.
No, part of the dilemma is so is there an objective way to measure it? No, but I don't think that means it doesn't matter. That's the problem, right? Is it matters a lot. If you could increase your chances of beating Trump by 20% if you're the Democratic Party. I think it's not 100-0, right? I think every one of those 17 candidates, 18 conditional on winning the nomination, which means they have shown certainly a decent amount of political skill, I think could win or lose to Trump, right? I don't think it matters that much where it's 90% versus 10% or 80% versus 20%. But I think, as you were saying earlier, there is this notion of like which candidates can be multiple things to multiple people, right? I think Obama showed some ability in 2008 where people who were on the left felt like he is my guy, he is transformative, right? It's a generational shift. But I think also a lot of independents felt like, you know what, he is a fundamentally kind of lowercase c conservative temperament, and he's a decent person, and he talks about the need to get past partisanship and whatever else. There are a few Republicans who seem to support him, right? And so he had that ability. You know, I'm not sure that Hillary Clinton did, by contrast, where people on the left didn't totally trust her, but people in the center saw her as very liberal. So, you know, I guess I have some views of which candidates show some potential to have those sorts of skills. I'm not sure that anyone has fully formed them yet, right? But you do hear, for example, about Pete Buttigieg, about people saying, conservatives saying, hey, look, he seems very reasonable in some ways. He seems like very conservative in certain ways, talking about the heartland. On the other hand, some Democrats say, oh, he's very transformative. He'd be the first gay candidate, and that would be, so that's one candidate I think might be interesting in that way. On the other hand, you know, how many people would not vote for a gay person for president? If you take polls, it's a liability for, I think, like around 35% of the electorate. By the way, being over age 75 is a big liability for a lot of voters as well. But there is, like, you know, I think we'll know more about electability in 6 months. And if we have another panel in November, we'll also have more data on who has the best favorability ratings and who's polling the best against Trump. Right now, it's not that meaningful because some candidates are very well known, some are not, right? So we'll know more about that later on. But I do think, like, can you, like, understand how to read the room and understand how to communicate with different types of people? And there's a skill in, like, controlling the media narrative as well, so you don't get typecast too much. Right. That's a key set of skills.
Yeah. I mean, it seems, I mean, so the conversation is tricky and it's a little bit confusing because on the one hand, there is a notion of headwinds, and we've talked about it in terms of the demographics, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, where we are willing to say there is a headwind, say, and then you have to figure out how much it is. But on the other hand, it's almost as if, yeah, there might be a headwind, but still it's, you know, Barack Obama got elected, you know, so it's not a, but how do you gauge the difference between that prospective question of headwind versus all of the more personal, charismatic, individual elements of the candidate that Jim, you're highlighting, right? It's kind of, both are true in a way. Both are true, and then it's so difficult to kind of predict which one is going to operate. Because it's got to be true that there are going to be probabilities associated with the headwind, but it is at the same time true that you can get beyond that, right?
Sure.
Right? But we can't figure out. But it almost feels impossible to figure out ex ante what those are, what those traits are, what that charisma might be, what that appeal might be.
And that's what we'll learn, I think, during, you know, the primaries, because I think you give me a charismatic woman of color, she can win. There's no question about that.
I think a gay candidate can win.
Yeah.
I totally think a gay candidate.
I think this gay candidate could win.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, given all the things about
Rhodes
Mayor
Scholar,
Pete,
veteran.
you know, so, you know, a veteran, all those other things that he has in his background. I think he could do
I mean,
that.
I covered Ohio in 2004, and I spent week after week going out with people campaigning against their statewide anti-domestic, whatever it was, the same-sex marriage bill that they were passing. And it clearly revved up that electorate and probably helped defeat the Democrat in November. And, you know, you go back to those same places, and I'll bet you a lot of those people are just fine with the idea of same-sex marriage now. The world's changed really rapidly. And, but the other thing I wanted to say is, like, what makes all of this so difficult is it is such an organic process. And, you know, the Democrats are going to have to, they're going to have to defeat, they're going to have to fight each other, and one of them's got to pull it out and win. But at the end of the day, it's going to be that person versus that person. It's going to be a two-person race, and how the Democrat matches up against Donald Trump is going to be crucial to it all. And certain people are going to probably match up better against him. Either maybe it'll be partly because of the policies they stake out, although their policies probably aren't going to be all that different. A lot of it is going to be how well they campaign and how they fend off the inevitable tweet storm every morning that's going to emanate from the White House. And, you know, I would not venture to say what the best strategy for dealing with that inevitability would be, but that candidate is going to have to know how to do it, and they're going to have to be good at it, and they're probably going to have a sense of humor. They're going to have to roll with a lot of punches, and who knows who that person is right
But
now.
one thing I think, you know, when, let's say 6 months from now, and Nate is running these candidates against Trump, to the extent that he identifies, I don't know, 3 or 4 candidates who will beat Trump pretty decisively, that's going to be a big plus for those people, that question of electability. That's going to be a big thing, I think, for Democratic voters.
Yeah,
because
but
the polling is
although to the point where, like,
self-fulfilling.
we might feel like it's overrated, right? Where if you get, like, you know, there was a point in time in, like, April and May 2016 where Hillary began to poll a lot better against McCain than Obama did. And sort of the reason why is that Hillary looked like she was not going to win the nomination. And so her cause was kind of championed by a lot of, like, independents and Republicans. And so you have to be a little bit careful about the kind of context of looking at those polls. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's tricky. You know, I think if 35% of people say they won't vote for a gay candidate, well, if they're the 35% that would not vote for any Democrat anyway, then it might not matter for Buttigieg as much. I think there's also something where, like, you know, I think there are Americans who like to demonstrate their tolerance, and so if you have the right type of black candidate or the right type, it's deliberately a very loaded phrasing, right? Or the right type of gay candidate, right? You know, we have had in Colorado, for example, which is sort of a swing state, sort of not, you know, gay people elected in Wisconsin. Tammy Baldwin is elected, and that's not a major talking point, her sexuality, really. Kirsten Sinema in Arizona, who identifies as bisexual. I think, you know, if we are being empirical, we do also have to look at the fact that Hillary Clinton lost a winnable election in 2016, and although I think Trump is underrated in some ways, I think we do have to ask, like, is being a woman a particular disadvantage? And you can look at the larger universe. Women did very, very well in general in races for Congress this past year. But I don't know, as someone who is both part of the press and a critic of the press, I do think that, like, women in particular face difficulties and double standards and tonality issues, the way they're covered by the press, that I think does add challenges to what they have to accomplish.
Mm. Karine, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to 2008 for just 1 second when we were talking about headwinds with people of color. Nate just talked about women in particular, but when you look at Obama back in 2008 in his presidential election, the map was different. Right? It was one of those things where you had to win Iowa. Winning Iowa meant that you were probably going to get the nomination. And he created this coalition, the Obama coalition that we hear about all the time. He inspired young people. He got a historic amount of African Americans to come out and vote, Latinos. It was something that he was able to create. And I would say a lot of things, right, have changed 11 years from 11 years ago. There's a reason why we see more diverse, a primary that's a lot more more diverse, where you see that the demographics in the Democratic base is much more diverse, where you see that African American women have come out in a historic numbers, or have been the highest groups to come out, even for Hillary Clinton in 2016. If you look at the races just across the board in the last 2 years, it's been African American women. So you see this kind of diverse base that has really has come up and has helped elect many candidates. So I think we've come a long way in 11 years, and I think, yeah, you could make an argument that a woman, a person of color, can beat Donald Trump, certainly win the nomination, potentially beat Donald Trump. So we've come a long way, and it's interesting kind of to see that. And what I mean, and just to go back to the path, Obama, it was Iowa. Once he won Iowa, it gave him that electability, and he was able to raise more money and go through the early states, through the Super Tuesday states, and really get all of these delegates that you need. And when you look at Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, the map is different. They don't have to win Iowa. They don't have to win New Hampshire. They have to do well, potentially win South Carolina. Then you have Texas and California, and so the map has changed a bit, which helps them in their election as well. But to what you just said, Nate, about women, that's a real question about, can women, even after saying all of that, can women get elected? We saw in focus groups in 2016 where people, not just men and women, were saying we shouldn't have a woman president. And that is something that's really, where are we as a country when it comes to that as well? So it's, there's a lot on the table.
Yeah, I was in Columbus, Ohio, when I was still thinking about this, and I was at a group, sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, which is Kamala's an AKA, this is the Delta, so there's that component. And I talked to these women, I remember the night before the event, and I said, well, tell me about, Kamala, what do you all think about her? Expecting to hear from these women, oh yeah, we're really for her. And it was really interesting to hear them say, well, I kind of like her, she's okay. And I said, well, what's that all about? They said, well, I don't know, she just, there's something, I'm not quite sure. I said, well, how do your husbands feel about her? And they said, oh, and almost to a person, these women said, they don't like her. These are black women talking about black husbands. And I said, why? And the men say, she's not strong enough. And that is, that's the headwind that women, I think still have to deal with, that can be disproved, as it was with Obama, if you pull a victory off early on. And as you said, I think the calendar is different now. I think Kamala, Cory Booker, they've got to do well. Wisconsin, in Iowa, in New Hampshire. South Carolina's the test.
Yeah,
it was interesting. I mean, I will not identify the person, but a very respected Obama strategist shared with me that this person's view that, so I didn't say his or her, this person's view that the person who won the plurality of the African American vote in the Democratic primary process, plurality of the African American vote was the likely nominee of the Democratic Party. But if anybody who wins over 50%, gets the majority of the African American vote, is definitely the nominee.
Yep. Yep.
So here's the theory. The headwind can turn into a tailwind. No, the idea being that, like, if there is what one would expect as some headwind, maybe this was in part the case with President Obama, and the candidate is able to overcome it, maybe through the Ohio or some other process today, then it might turn into an advantage in the sense that it's viewed as, wait a minute, this person can really overcome that headwind, and therefore they can kind of any statistical support for that?
I mean, I don't know if it's statistical. Again, other than the fact that you do have people of color, and you do have women, and you do have gay and lesbian people who have been elected to office in swing states. I mean, yeah, look, I think, Pete Buttigieg, if he were not gay, might be seen as less interesting to people.
Right.
You know, I do think with the gendered thing, I mean, this sounds like really banal and obvious, right? It is worth noting that that women are 51% of the population, whereas LGBT people are around 5%, and African Americans are around 12%, right? So there's something about the fact that if you live in certain states, can go around and not see very many black people. If you live in Vermont or Wyoming or something, right? You can go around and pretend you don't see very many gay people. You know, no one except Mike Pence is able to live their life without seeing women, I guess. But
certainly being in the room with them.
But I think there is except his wife.
Yeah.
But there is
Mother.
some invisibility to the challenge women face that maybe they don't get that tailwind, right? You didn't see a lot of discourse. You saw some, but not a lot of discourse in 2016 around Hillary Clinton being a barrier-breaking candidate. It was almost perfunctory. When she won the nomination, it was oh, well, she finally won this one after not winning 2008, and Bernie sure gave her a big challenge, but yeah, she broke the glass ceiling, great for her, right? There was a quarter of a day where that was a topic of the news cycle, and it kind of faded out. And so maybe if you're a woman, you face all the obviously historic barriers and all the baggage that comes with being a woman when we've only had male presidents, but you don't get that tailwind as much. I'm thinking out loud here, maybe it's a dumb theory, but that
No, it's not a dumb theory.
So do you not think that a woman candidate wouldn't help energize what is obviously a huge part of the electorate, and particularly a Democratic base, against a president who's clearly the guy's president?
I mean, look, there are more women than men in the electorate, so that helps a little bit. I mean, to me, the gender gap, to have a large gender gap, is neither inherently good or bad, because it means that there's a gap, but if Trump is winning 70% of the male vote, then winning 70% of the female vote for Democrats puts you just back at 50-50 roughly. Look, I don't know. I mean, you do look again at all the Senate and House races where, number one, women did really well in the general election, but also women had a very, very good record when they were running against other men in the Democratic primary, right? So part of it is you look at this field now, and if you look at the polls, and you have, Bernie, Biden, Beto, and Kamala Harris, the top four candidates. Bernie and Biden a ways ahead of the third and fourth place candidate, right? It seems like a little bit weird that three of those four candidates are white men. And so maybe that means that systematically the white men's chances are overrated if you're looking at kind of who's actually voting in the Democratic primary. Maybe it means that that Bernie and Biden are just weird exceptions. Obviously, Biden is quite popular with African Americans because of association with President Obama. Bernie does better than you might think with minority voters, although I think he's not necessarily a lot of first choice for voters of color in the Democratic Party. But it does seem like, I don't know, right? Given how well women did in the primary, that maybe a Warren or a Klobuchar or a Gillibrand, right? Because those are three candidates where I kind of scratch my head a little bit and I ask, why are those three not doing better?
That's exactly right.
Why are they stuck at 1% or 5% when they seemed pretty formidable, to me anyway, before running? And I don't know. And one answer when something doesn't make sense might be that, well, when it gets sorted out more, then they'll gain ground in the polls.
I think right now there's 6 out of the 18 Democratic, declared candidates are women. So it's 33% basically. So it wouldn't be so odd that if you're looking at the top 4, those numbers, that would be 3 to 1. But particularly with Bernie and Biden, who represent kind of an older generation, perhaps, of politics.
Well, I would say that it seems like some of the more tokenish candidates seem to be white men, right? Eric Swalwell is not one of those people who I think is one of the more likely nominees, right? Tim Ryan, I guess, sort of interesting, but gotten awfully late. If Seth Moulton runs, I feel like it's also interesting that when people declared at first, you had all the women declared early. All the people of color declared early. Pete Buttigieg declared very early because they're like, you know, as someone who is not a straight white man, I have like a lot of disadvantages to overcome, and I have more time I need to spend earning the trust of voters, right? Whereas like Joe Biden's just sitting there being like, oh, maybe I'll run and maybe I'll wait another month, right? You know, Steve Bullock in Montana is like, I'm going to wait until the legislative session in Montana is complete and then I'll make a decision. Like, no fucking Democratic voter cares about the legislative session in Montana, right? If you want to run for president, put your name in the ring now. So the fact that you have all these kind of white candidates who are sitting back, and because 2 months ago it was like half women or 60% women, and now you've had like, you know, the Hickenloopers and the Jay Insleys and the Tim Ryans come along, and so all of a sudden you actually have a field that is pretty white and pretty male.
All right, we should open it up to some questions. I imagine there are a lot of questions.
Oh, wow.
In the hall.
lot of
Do we have a
hands.
microphone somewhere? Yes.
This man not only raised his hand, he stood up, so he should go first.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask about the structural and practical question. And in terms of the long-term future of our democracy, and also, for example, when you have a field of 18, 20 candidates, would we be better off moving to rank order transferable voting?
I'm sorry, transferable voting.
Rank order,
Oh, ranked order.
transferable voting.
Well, or Maine, I think,
Jim.
right?
Jim, yeah?
Oh, Maine
Jim,
has that.
what do you
That's
think?
right.
I mean, you know, there's a good argument to be made that it leads to, and Nate probably knows the statistics behind this better than I do, but you know, the idea being that you might end up with a candidate or an elected official who better represents the sort of broad consensus of the local or national politics through ranked choice voting, which is so complicated, I'm not even going to try to explain it, but basically you're ranking several candidates and your opponents are being knocked out round by round. And so that means you could win a lot of second place votes and still win the election, which suggests that it's a way to sort of reduce polarization. And you know, I think it's a really fascinating experiment going on in Maine, and I think a couple cities, maybe San Francisco, I forget, a couple cities are trying it, and you know, it's really worth watching, I think. Don't see us going there nationally anytime soon, but individual states might join.
I mean, I think it would definitely have the advantage that one concern here is that, you know, you might get a lot of votes for Biden or something, but then that doesn't tell you much about how all of those folks would vote in second place, right? In case, you know. And so I think that it could potentially give a lot more information to us about the question of electability, I would think, specifically. Any other thoughts on rank ordering?
Ain't gonna happen.
Ain't gonna.
Yeah,
All
oh my
right.
gosh,
Okay.
it's not gonna happen.
No, not to say that it might not be worthy. I don't think that's how we're wound.
Okay. I saw another question over there.
There's a lot of hands. Ooh.
Hi, so I have a simple question. It seems that the current primary, in order to win it, a lot of candidates are tacking more to the left. But in 2018, we saw that kind of tacking to the center is what really won. And when you kind of look at the map for 2020, a lot of the key battlegrounds have a relatively reddish hue, specifically in Ohio and Florida. So just be interested in kind of your thoughts about that. If you were a candidate or you're advising a candidate, how you'd recommend they navigate being able to win the left and in kind of using the Romney parallel of 2012 Etch-a-Sketch to then win in the general.
Advising a candidate. Let's see.
I mean,
Karine.
I think, so the New York Times Upshot blog had a great piece today about which Democrats are vocal on Twitter and social media versus what the overall Democratic electorate looks like.
Yeah.
And so people on social media are number one, younger, number two, more to the left, number three, whiter, and number four, more politically engaged. And so in some sense, if I were advising a candidate, I might say, go against Twitter and try and build a coalition that's ethnically diverse, that includes older Democrats, that is maybe not centrist exactly, but where you're not having to say 4 or 5 things that you're going to have to walk back in the general election, and you find appeal to people who are not political junkies, right? You know, I think that's some of why Biden, although he has a lot of problems, might be a little bit underrated. You know, I have an article coming out on Beto O'Rourke, and I think he actually, if you look at the issues he's highlighting, I think they reflect the fact that he comes from a district that is majority Hispanic. So the issue he mentions the most, for example, is education. And if you poll Hispanic voters, what's your most important issue? It's not immigration, it's education. So I think sometimes things that like are not the big hot debates in the media are things that the candidates can find ways to, number one, appeal to Democrats that are more neglected in the primary, and maybe without having to, like I said, having to walk back stuff in the general election as much.
Yeah, I would tell them to stay away from labels. Like, do not go into the, oh, I'm a progressive, I'm a, you know, a liberal, I'm a socialist. Just stay away from those labels and just talk about the issues. Right. Because the issues will resonate. And be bold about it, but also be inclusive. And I think that's the thing that we miss. It's, you can talk about, it's not just about white working class, it's about, you know, black working class, Latino working class, and we can talk about an issue like education, like college affordability, like healthcare, that affects everyone. And I think that's the miss. When I see these candidates start talking about socialism, or talking about I'm more progressive than the other, that's when we're kind of following the trap that Republicans are laying out for us. And so I say, don't use the labels, talk about the issues. And that's what we saw actually in 2018, is the issues were being talked about. I went to Texas, I went to Georgia, I went to Orange County in California, and when you talk about the issues, it brought everybody together.
Okay. And when you say talk about the issues, you're not saying talk about policy recommendations. You're talking about the issue and your values? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think it's important to talk about the issues and the values of it. I think what we're going to see in this Democratic primary is how do you solve it, right? There's going to be a real conversation about policy, right? What does that look like? And people, they need to bring forth what their policies are going to look like for healthcare, for education, and we're seeing that from many of them. But I guess what I'm saying is, you talk about the things, the bread and butter things that matter to people, but also you have to back it up. That does matter how you back it up. That's how how people are going to be differentiated from each other, what their policy looks like on the issues that they're talking about. But for the Democratic base, that really energizes people. When you talk about healthcare, when you talk about education, when you talk about college affordability, and it doesn't matter if you're a white working class or if you're living in an urban area, it doesn't matter, because we're all dealing with the same things. And then there's another kind of level of just talking about inequality, which matters as well. And you see that when we talk about criminal justice, when we talk about affordable housing, that matters as well to certain communities, and it's important to have those real conversations too.
Yeah, I mean, in my work for the redistricting committee last year, I was in 25 different states, and I think the point that Karine made is exactly right. A focus on the issues. You know, what is it that matters to people? Gretchen Whitmer, who is a coming star, the governor of Michigan, her campaign slogan was "Fix the damn roads." You know, I mean, it sounds kind of silly, you know, and yet it drew her. I think she's a progressive, you know, liberal and all that stuff, and yet she was able to show herself to be a person who was concerned with where you were. What was it that mattered to you? Fix the damn road. So, you know, you drive in your car, you hit a pothole, whoop, Gretchen Whitmer, fix the damn roads. And I saw candidate after candidate talking about, you know, the protection of people with, you know, medical issues and, you know, the movement away from Obamacare. That resonated, you know, with people. Issues matter.
Jim, your ears were perking on the question of policy versus issue versus values.
I mean, I think with Karine, I think I basically agree with Karine. I think actually voters, most voters, not, you know, people places like Colombia, don't think about policy. I just don't think they can differentiate one candidate's policies from another. And the press will rake candidates over the coals if they don't have a detailed policy plan. And maybe that affects how some voters look at them, but I just don't think that breaks through. I think it really comes down to the values, as you put it, that, that people express. Either they signal it in very organic ways, or they talk very head-on about what they care about. And that I think candidates who don't have a really, really clear sense of personal value and how that translates into their mission for running are always going to be in trouble. They're going to be looking for polling data to figure out how to get out of fixes, and they're not going to. They're not going to know exactly where to go when they're confronted with hard questions.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for 2 more quick questions in front. And then you. Yes.
Hi, just several things I want to say real quick before I get to the question and put it in context.
Well, let's go to the question. Let's go to the question.
Okay. Okay, the question is this. One of the problems the Democrats seem to have is resonating with different groups, different regions of the country. So how do we get past that perception? And you can't get into policy. That doesn't resonate with most people throughout the country. It's got to be bread and butter issues. And that's going to be very problematic for the Democrats, I think. And also, don't forget 58% of white women voted for Trump. So it's not just gender symbolism that's going to work for the Democrats either.
I mean, in
53%.
53, yeah.
In the electability discussion, one thing we didn't touch on is just what region the candidate is from. The fact is that the Midwest has more swing electoral votes than the other regions of the country, probably followed by the South, if you count Florida in particular, North Carolina. Probably followed by the West, and then the Northeast in last place. So that might be relevant, and maybe other things being equal, you'd nominate a candidate from the middle of the country because there is some kind of regional advantage. But look, to kind of tie this together to the previous question, I think people want to hear, fundamentally they want to hear, if nothing else, like, why do you want to be president, and why do you think you out of all 320 million people should be president, right? So I think one problem that Democrats have more than Republicans, because Democrats are inherently a coalitional party, is that you can have like a candidate, and I think Clinton had this problem where like there was like a laundry list of reasons without a lot of prioritization and without necessarily having the kind of fundamental clear answer of why should you be president, why do you want to be president. And so I think having that kind of clarity of message, I think, is important.
Great. In the third row here in front, in the center.
Thank you. It's been very interesting listening to which of the contenders appeal to Democrats. But it's not important, because we know that all the Democrats are going to go out and vote against Trump, pretty much all. Perhaps we should be talking about who will appeal to the swing voters, the independents, and not who will appeal to the Democrats.
Well,
Anyone want to talk about that, or getting out the base? I mean, in part, I mean I don't think the question gets to who's going to get out the base of who's going to get out the massive Democratic votes that are necessary, right? In other words, so I mean, there is a question of who's at the margin and who could be swung, but I think that turnout is probably going to be the most critical issue in this election. But I'm not a statistician. Turnout?
Yeah.
I mean, look, for a long time, the Convention of Wisdom was exactly that, right? That like it's all about winning independent voters. and that the parties all get their bases, so it's independents that matter, right? And that flipped, I think, again, in part because of Obama in 2012, where he did win by having a bigger base and turning out an equal or larger segment of that base, because he lost independents narrowly to Romney. You know, I might argue that I think independents have now become underrated because everything is always overcompensating. You know, it probably isn't 30% of the country or 35%. If you ask people in polls, are you independent? About 35% say yes. Probably only half that number or a third of that number are truly independent and truly swing voters.
I think that's right.
And I do think they matter a fair bit. As far as like which candidates they would prefer, that was like a backdoor to ask about electability, which I'm not sure I'm ready to associate particular names with that. But like part of the problem is like, look, there is a version of Joe Biden that does very well with these kind of white working class swing voters. And there's a version of Joe Biden that is the candidate that did frankly pretty badly in the 2 previous times that he ran for president, and is 77 years old, and is making lots of gaffes he doesn't realize are gaffes, right? And that he turns out to be a very poor candidate. And the best way to adjudicate that is to have him actually run and see what happens. So that's why it's like hard to say like right now who will appeal to people in the middle. You know, I do think the one candidate who seems not that interested in the middle is Bernie, I suppose. But on the other hand, he has done transformational things. He got elected in Vermont at a time when actually it was not normal to have Democrats, let alone socialists, elected in Vermont. And he does have that advantage of like, he obviously is going to raise a lot of money and have a good turnout operation. So he is a candidate who you would be counting on the base strategy to win. You know, it doesn't have to be a turnout if you can have both in theory, but who it is, I don't know.
But tell me if I'm wrong about this, but isn't it true also that there were a number, I don't know what the number might be, maybe I'm making this up, but that of Bernie voters who voted for Trump?
There are, but there is some question about whether those were good faith Bernie voters. Not that they were necessarily trying to like disrupt the nomination process, but you have a lot of people, especially in like the South and the Appalachian states, where they're vestigially Democratic, where you might be registered as a Democrat, and if you're turning out to vote in the Democratic primary, you sure don't like Hillary Clinton very much. And by the way, Hillary won a lot of those voters in 2008 because, you know, it was like, well, we don't want to elect a black person in West Virginia, for example. And so I do think maybe 20% of Bernie's vote from last time were people who were actually kind of closet Republicans, so to speak. You know, and he's going to have a different coalition this time. But he is making a bigger and bolder play, right? He is saying that my message can be transformational, and that this country that has traditionally thought of itself as a capitalist country might be ready to move on and think of itself very differently. To me, that involves a bigger risk-reward profile than Beto might or Cory Booker might or something, where the implications of Bernie winning would be transformational, but I do think, other things held equal, he might have more challenges facing accusations that, you know, what's weird about Bernie is that like he in some ways did not face a lot of scrutiny in 2016 because he wasn't taking that seriously. There are lots of disadvantages to not being taken that seriously, but like people have not litigated like kind of what he might have thought in the 70s or the 80s, or people have not litigated like you know, previous writings of his or whatever else. You're seeing now more focus on his tax, which he says he's going to release. But you know, Democrats should be really tough on one another. All these issues are going to come out eventually, and if you have an issue that somehow doesn't come out in the primary, it will come out in the general election. And Trump is not going to shy away from making the most vigorous, most vulgar, you know, most exaggerated version of whichever critique that Democrats will have to stand for. So people shouldn't worry that much about civility beyond a certain margin. Voters should be civil to one another, to other voters in their party, but the candidates don't need to be civil to one another. You have to like actually kind of test their mettle running against Trump.
Interesting. All right, so this is how we're going to end. I've realized that I'm not going to be able to get our 4 panelists to actually weigh in on who they think is going to is going to win. So we're going to best them. We've got enough people in this room to do an amazing random sample. Okay. And we're going to test this out. So I'm going to name you.
Nate, pay
I'm going to
attention
name you the
now. Pay
name.
attention.
Nate, pay
This is your
attention.
sample.
I'm going to
Your
name you
respondents.
7 candidates who've been named on the stage. I'm not going to name everybody. Okay. And if you think that they have, if you think they are electable, if you think that they're the one that is most electable, raise your hand up high. Okay. And then we'll see. We'll figure it out. Nate, you're going to be watching.
Are you allowing
okay?
double voting? Or
Say what?
Are you allowing double voting? Is people change their mind?
You know, okay, here we go. If you're really sure, raise your hand up high. If you're kind of sure, go like this. So it's so we're doing Irish.
Do ranked choice voting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to only name the people who've been named during the course of this conversation. All right. You ready? Cory Booker.
Oh.
Pete Buttigieg.
Oh, wow.
Gillibrand.
Home state senator.
Kamala Harris.
Oh, wow.
Klobuchar. Our own home team, Columbia College graduate, Beto O'Rourke.
Oh,
That's interesting.
that's interesting.
Bernie Sanders.
Huh. Okay.
Elizabeth Warren. Joseph Biden.
Oh, wow.
This is very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally not what I would have
It's
thought.
the same. Well, this is
So
what did
let
you
me
pick?
just
The big 2 were.
Nate. Who's
Nate.
who was that?
It
Who's
was like
that head here?
Kamala
Kamala
and
and
Buttigieg.
Buttigieg.
Kamala and
Yeah, Kamala and Buttigieg. And
But they're like the intellectuals candidates, and Warren. Who did
Warren did well
All you
too.
smart folks, you know.
The intellect.
All right. Okay. All right.
That was
Well,
really interesting.
That was interesting. Okay. All right. So, you sure you guys don't want to raise your hand on any of these?
Oh, no.
No.
I know
Nate,
who's going to win.
Oh, all right. Okay. So
I'm not
we'll
telling
end-
you.
Hold on.
I'm not telling you. I'll write it down and give you on a piece of paper.
All right. Okay. We'll take sealed votes. Listen, thank you so much for a terrific conversation, Eric, Jim, Karine, and Nate, and thank you for coming out to another great holder session. And we look forward to seeing you next year. We will actually have a session in November, so maybe we'll be back on elections, and we'd love to have you all back. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. That was great.